Welcome to Midnight Chronicles, where the darkest stories come to life just before you drift to sleep. Let us know what part of the world are you watching this from and at what time. Tonight, we'll take you on a journey through the strange, dark, mysterious, and the terrifying. That's what this channel is all about, and if you are into these kind of stuff, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We post fresh new content 3 to 4 times a week. Now, let's begin with today's story.
When the Harris family moved into the old Victorian house on Maplewood Street, they were full of optimism. Sarah and Tom, along with their 2 young children, Emily and Max, had searched for months for a home that would offer them more space and a sense of peace. They had heard the rumors, of course. The house was old, and some people claimed it was a bit quirky, but to Sarah and Tom, those were just stories. The house was perfect for their growing family. A beautiful 3-story home with a big garden and plenty of room for the kids to play. It seemed like the perfect place to start anew. The house had stood empty for several years, but that didn't seem unusual. Houses sometimes stayed on the market for a while, especially the older ones. Sarah loved its charm. The high ceilings, the ornate moldings, the sweeping staircase. Tom liked the backyard, a massive, overgrown area that could be transformed into a dream space with a little work. They signed the papers and moved in, where Jocelyn and Teresa would just about do for a meal plan. On the first night, after an exhausting day of unpacking, Sarah, Tom, Emily, and Max sat down in the living room, surrounded by boxes and the warm glow of their fireplace. They were tired, but happy. "It's going to be great," Tom said, his voice filled with enthusiasm. "A new chapter." But as Sarah sat there, her gaze drifted to the staircase in the corner of the room. There was something about it that unsettled her. The shadows in the stairwell seemed darker than they should have been, as if they were shifting in the dim light. She quickly shook the feeling off, convincing herself it was just exhaustion. Tomorrow, she thought, we'll unpack more and make this place feel like home. That night, Sarah woke to the sound of a faint creaking. At first, she thought it was the house settling, a natural sound in an old home. But then it happened again, louder this time. She turned to Tom, who was fast asleep beside her, and listened carefully. The creaking seemed to be coming from upstairs. It was as if someone, or something, was walking across the floor above them. She held her breath, straining to hear. There was another creak, followed by the distinct sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. Sarah's heart began to race. Tom stirred in his sleep, but didn't wake up. She got out of bed slowly, trying not to make a sound, and crept to the door of their bedroom. She peered out into the hallway, but it was pitch black. The only sound was the faint thumping of her own heartbeat in her ears. She moved cautiously toward the staircase, the creaking growing louder with each step she took. When she reached the foot of the stairs, she stopped and stared up into the dark abyss of the second floor. The sound had stopped, but the air felt heavy, thick, cold. "Tom?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. No response. She took a deep breath, turned, and went back to bed. The rest of the night was uneventful, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She tried to tell herself it was just her imagination. Maybe the house really was settling, as old houses do. But deep down, she couldn't help but feel that something, or someone, was watching her. Over the next few weeks, the family settled in. They spent their days unpacking and fixing up the house. The kids quickly made friends with the neighbors, and the house began to feel like home. But there were moments that couldn't be explained away so easily. One afternoon, while Sarah was in the kitchen preparing lunch, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps above her head. Slowly, she put down the knife she was using and stood perfectly still. The footsteps were heavy, deliberate, like someone walking across the floor in boots. She glanced up at the ceiling, waiting for the noise to stop, but it didn't. The footsteps grew louder, and then they stopped directly above her. She gripped the edge of the counter, her heart pounding in her chest. "Tom?" she called, her voice shaking. "Tom? Are you up there?" But there was no answer. The house was eerily silent, the only sound being the hum of the refrigerator. With trembling hands, Sarah grabbed the kitchen broom and slowly made her way upstairs. She felt foolish, as if she were being paranoid. But something felt off. When she reached the top of the stairs, she checked the 2 rooms on the second floor, both empty. Max was playing in his room and Emily was reading in hers. There was no one else in the house. Confused, Sarah returned downstairs and tried to brush it off. It was probably just the house settling, she reasoned again. But as the days passed, the unexplained occurrences continued. A few weeks later, Emily came running down the stairs, her face pale and wide-eyed. "Mom, I saw someone," she said, her voice trembling. "In the hallway upstairs." Sarah knelt down beside her, trying to calm her. "Emily, what do you mean? What did you see?" Emily's voice was barely a whisper. "There was a man, standing at the top of the stairs, looking down at me. He had a face, but it was all wrong, like it was melting or something. I couldn't see his eyes, he just stared." Sarah's stomach dropped. "Did he say anything?" Emily shook her head. "No. He just stood there, staring, and then he was gone." Tom wasn't home at the time, but Sarah decided to call a local historian to learn more about the house's past. She was reluctant to jump to conclusions, but Emily's story weighed heavily on her mind. The historian, Mrs. Blackwell, was an elderly woman with a keen interest in local history. She told Sarah that the house had been built in the late 1800s by a prominent local family, the Montgomerys. The house had been a place of lavish parties and gatherings until a tragedy struck. One night, during a storm, the Montgomery family's youngest son had gone missing. The boy, whose name was Henry, was never found. After his disappearance, the house fell into disrepair and the Montgomerys moved away. Mrs. Blackwell's voice lowered as she spoke. "There are rumors, though," she added. "Some people believe Henry never left the house, that he lingered." The more Sarah learned about the house's dark history, the more she began to feel that something wasn't right. The footsteps above, the strange coldness that seemed to settle over certain rooms, and now Emily's terrifying encounter, it all pointed to one thing. The house was haunted. But it wasn't just the kids who were affected. Sarah herself began having vivid nightmares. In these dreams, she would be walking through the darkened hallways of the house, hearing the faint sound of footsteps behind her. When she turned around, there was nothing there, only the oppressive silence. One night, she woke to the sound of soft crying coming from the hallway. It was the sound of a child, faint, sorrowful, almost as if the child were in distress. She felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead. She got out of bed and moved slowly toward the door. As she opened it, she was greeted by a sight that froze her in her tracks. At the foot of the stairs stood a small figure, shrouded in shadow. The figure was facing away from her, but she could see the outline of a child. Small, fragile, and hunched over. The crying continued, a haunting, broken sound that echoed through the house. "Emily," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. The figure turned slowly, revealing the face of a boy. His features were distorted as if his face had been stretched and warped. His eyes were hollow, dark voids. The boy's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Only an unbearable, soul-crushing silence. And then he was gone. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the Maplewood house, Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of dread. After everything that had happened, the footsteps, the whispers, Emily's terrifying encounter, and the chilling dreams, it seemed as though the house had decided it wasn't going to let them go without a fight. Sarah had called in Thomas Whitley, a seasoned paranormal investigator. He had dealt with hauntings before, but he warned them this might be one of the most dangerous cases he'd ever encountered. The activity in the house had grown worse over the past week. Objects moved on their own. The air grew thick with an oppressive energy. And Sarah had begun to feel like she was losing her mind. She was desperate to rid the house of whatever malevolent force lingered there, and she clung to the hope that Whitley might be their last chance. That night, Tom, Sarah, Emily, Max, and Whitley gathered in the living room, the tension palpable in the air. The children were sitting on the floor, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear. Whitley set up his equipment, the temperature gauges, cameras, and EVP recorders, while Sarah and Tom looked on nervously. The investigator began by asking the spirits to make themselves known. At first, there was nothing, just an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the old house. But then, as Whitley began to chant an incantation, the atmosphere shifted. The air turned cold, like an invisible fog settling over them. The temperature dropped so quickly that their breaths became visible in the dim light. Sarah's skin prickled, and she instinctively wrapped her arms around herself for warmth. "Henry Montgomery," Whitley called, his voice firm but not without a trace of caution. "I know you're here. You don't belong in this house anymore. You are not welcome." Suddenly, the room seemed to vibrate with a low, guttural growl. The air itself seemed to hum with the weight of something ancient and angry. Sarah's heart pounded as the temperature dropped further, and she could feel the presence of something watching them from the darkness. Without warning, the lights flickered and then went out completely, plunging them into total darkness. A voice, deep and distorted, echoed through the room. "Leave, or I will take you. Take them all." Emily screamed, her voice high-pitched with terror. Max clutched his sister's hand, his eyes wide with fear. But it was Sarah who felt the full force of the malevolent presence in the room. It was as if the house itself were alive, its walls breathing, shifting, pressing in on them. From the far corner of the room, a shadow began to take form, a dark, indistinct shape that twisted and writhed like smoke, but with a presence that was undeniable. As it grew more solid, Sarah could see the figure of a boy, his face twisted, distorted as though it were melting. His eyes were black voids, empty, staring at her with an insatiable hunger. It was Henry. Tom stepped forward, his voice shaking but resolute. "You can't have us. Leave us alone. This is our home now." But the entity didn't retreat. Instead, it grew more powerful, its form rippling like smoke in a storm. The temperature plunged further, and the walls of the house groaned under the pressure. The floor beneath their feet began to vibrate, as if something was trying to break through from below. "Henry, stop!" Whitley shouted, his voice now commanding. "We are not afraid of you. You cannot control this place anymore." But the ghost of Henry did not listen. In an instant, the boy's face contorted into a horrific grin, and he lunged forward, his hands reaching for them. The lights flickered again, this time revealing something truly horrific. The walls around them seemed to melt away, the house warping and stretching as if it were being consumed by the darkness. The spirit of Henry twisted in the air, his form shifting between a child and something far darker, a creature of pure malice. "Get away from them!" Whitley shouted, his voice rising above the chaos. He pulled a small vial from his pocket, shaking it, and poured its contents into a circle drawn on the floor. As soon as the liquid hit the ground, there was a flash of light, and the room filled with an overwhelming, deafening noise, like 1,000 voices screaming at once. The shadow that had been Henry screamed in return, an ear-piercing sound that shook the very foundation of the house. It reached out, its hand, a dark, writhing mass, grabbing for Sarah. In that instant, the floor beneath her cracked open. It felt as though the house itself were swallowing them whole. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as the ground buckled beneath her and she screamed, falling into the black void below. But just as the darkness swallowed her, Whitley reached out, grabbing her arm and yanking her back. "Not today," he muttered, pulling her to safety. For a split second, time seemed to stop. The entity, Henry, let out one final soul-crushing wail. The air crackled with power. And then, with an explosive burst of light, the dark presence was gone. The silence that followed was deafening. The air grew still and warm, and the oppressive heaviness that had lingered over the house for so long lifted. It was as if the very soul of the house had been freed. Tom pulled Sarah into his arms, shaking. Emily and Max clung to each other, trembling, but both seemed to be unharmed. Whitley, exhausted but resolute, wiped his brow. "It's over," he said, his voice soft but firm. "It's finally over." The family looked around, unsure of what to say, but they all felt the same sense of disbelief. It had happened. The house had been cleansed, but as Sarah stood there, her eyes scanning the now silent room, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching her. There was no sign of the malevolent force that had terrorized them for so long, yet the house felt different, almost as if it had been a part of something far older, something far more dangerous. As she turned to leave the room, she glanced at the staircase. For just a moment, she thought she saw something, a shadow, fleeting and indistinct, lurking at the top. Her heart skipped a beat. Then it was gone. The house was still. The silence returned. But Sarah knew, deep down, that there were things in the dark that they might never understand. And even though they had survived, there were whispers in the walls that would never fully fade away. In the weeks that followed, the Harris family tried to move on with their lives. The haunting seemed to have stopped, and the house felt lighter, warmer. They'd had the house blessed, and everything appeared to be returning to normal. But Sarah couldn't forget the feeling she'd had that night, the sensation that they were never truly alone. The nightmares continued, though less frequently, and sometimes late at night, when the house was completely still, she would hear the faintest sound, like a child's cry, distant but undeniably there. One night, as Sarah sat on the porch, staring out at the garden, she noticed something strange. A figure, small and shadowed, standing by the gate at the far end of the yard. She squinted, but when she blinked, it was gone. Perhaps it was just her imagination, but then again, maybe not. The house on Maplewood Street had given them peace, at least for now. But Sarah knew one thing for sure. Some things never truly leave. Some things linger, waiting for the next person to come along. And in the quiet of the night, sometimes, when the wind howls just right, the house seems to whisper its secrets.